I see them. Raising his head at the hunter's voice, Jarl Ostrog peered into the distance. Where? He asked. Where the scouts said they were coming from, the hunter answered. That's why we're here, right? His long white mustache twitched at the hunter's flippant answer. How many made it up here? They just appeared, the hunter replied, and it looks like there's plenty more coming. Jarl Ostrog's eyes narrowed further, trying to figure out what he was looking at. Still, damn hunters, what were they doing? How did so many get by all the chutes? He asked. We did send people up there, didn't we? They should have been in position over a day ago, the hunter said, but I haven't heard anything at all. Jarl Ostrog looked up along the slopes of the steep valley that the glacier had carved out. There were no visible signs of any avalanches being set off, no clouds of powder or tremors in the air. Those undead from the Dwarven Road don't climb up mountains, do they? They've been there for weeks now, the hunter replied, and all they did was stand there watching the sledges go back and forth. It didn't add up. His mind went down a list of possibilities. The hunters that they sent couldn't have all just failed to scale the peaks. Any of these undead trying to climb up after them would simply be picked off by boulders. Could it be frost dragons? The dwarves, these undead, the dragons, they're all under the same, new master now, aren't they? Could be, the hunter nodded slightly. The hunters would stand no chance against a frost dragon if they were caught mid-climb. We wouldn't have noticed the fighting either. Jarl Ostrog let out an annoyed breath, scanning the slopes once again. Giants and dragons might be considered large by the standards of other races, but they were still mere specks against a mountain. Well, no matter the reason, the fact was that the hazards that they had intended on using lay unused. A dull murmur arose from the frost giant line. In the distance, about halfway down the glacier, a crimson something appeared. The something grew until it divided in his vision to become two. They became more distinct shortly after and could be seen fluttering in the wind beside one another, flags or banners of some sort. Below them, a column marched forward, black figures nearly flush with the rocks and dirt of the glacier's moraine. As the minutes passed, individual members of the enemy army could be seen, their armor gleaming in the morning sun. Dozens, then hundreds snaked their way up in a column that brought to mind tales of the great, venomous dragon that would appear from the seas at the end of the world. The column split, spreading out into a line below them. He furrowed his brow. It was beyond the effective range of most of their hunters. Should we begin? The hunter who had first spotted the enemy asked, placing a hand on a pile of boulders. I best can still hit them easily from here, especially when they're all nicely lined up like that. Jarl Ostrog nodded and gave the signal to commence the attack. Shouts rose from all along the line. Within moments, dozens of boulders hurtled down the slope. The conditions of the day were not ideal, but their position was still overwhelmingly advantageous. 300 warriors and 200 hunters were lined along the rim of the wide bowl that fed into the glacier below. The enemy arranged before them would have to weather a storm of attacks as they attempted to advance nearly a kilometer up the slope between the two battle lines. It would have been better if clouds or a blizzard concealed the frost giant forces, but worse if they had come at night. The limited range of their dark vision meant that the enemy would have been able to come much closer unnoticed. No retaliation rose from the black figures below, and Jarl Ostrog nodded in satisfaction. He was more than happy to accept this sort of confrontation. Dull clunks issued from below as boulders struck the enemy lines. A few of the projectiles could be seen flying high into the air as they bounced off of their marks. 50, or 100? He asked. 50, the hunter grunted as he hurled another boulder. 50 kilograms, roughly. They had boulders of varying weights collected in a veritable wall before them, and they were currently using the lightest to make the distance to the enemy force. Though they were the lightest, one thrown by a powerful hunter was enough to instantly destroy almost any target that wasn't a giant, a dragon, or some powerful monster. The enemy line, however, continued to form, seemingly unperturbed by the assault. Are they being harmed at all? Jarl Ostrog frowned as he watched. They should be, the hunter said, but it's hard to tell. The undead just keep going until they're destroyed. One thing's for certain, they're a lot tougher than the skeletons that pop up once in a while. We can do this all day, Jarl Ostrog said. Grind them to dust. Clunk. Clunk, clunk. Clunk. Clang. Clunk. Boulders continued to rain down the slope. The enemy formation remained pristine, But if what the hunter said was correct, they would remain like that until they suddenly fell apart. A nearby warrior yawned loudly. The hunter raised his next boulder, then paused. Something's happening. Are they finally going down? The answer came when sections of the enemy line broke away to come forward. What are they doing? He muttered. 5 distinct groups came forward, each assuming a formation that resembled a blunted diamond. 100. The hunter's call was relayed up and down the line, and their attack resumed again. As the enemy formation came closer, he saw that each member had drawn tightly against the next, locking their shields together. Even the 100-kilogram boulders that struck them were deflected away. 200. Their assault intensified. More hunters started to join in. The diamond formations increased their pace in perfect unison, causing many of the attacks to overreach. 400. Boulders the size of elk smashed into the wall of shields. He had never seen the like before. The lowland tribes that they raided in the valleys and forests below could not withstand even one small boulder, never mind so many large ones. Those who were foolish enough to raise their pitiful shields in an attempt to block were crushed as if they had no protection at all. 600. The warriors joined, doubling the volume of the torrent of stone. As unshakable as they appeared to be from a distance, he could now see the formations being jostled by the attacks that assailed them. Within 50 meters of the line, they stopped from the sheer force of the frost giants' combined assault. Jarl barked out a laugh amidst the clamor of stone and ice striking metal. The other Jarls had been too timid and opted to stay out of the battle. The honor and glory for this victory would be his alone. Looks like that's as far as they go, he crowed. Pound them to. As one, the frost giant army collapsed to the ground. 200 meters behind the Death Knight lines, Cocytus expelled a breath. The dwarf beside him shuddered. Did I do that? The commander-in-chief was aghast, his face turned ashen gray. Cocytus glanced down at him. The dwarf had come to personally witness the battle, and Cocytus had granted him the privilege of carrying out the plan that he had put together with the rest of the war council. This was not simply to give credit where it was due, or serve as a diplomatic gesture, but an experiment to confirm the presence of certain abilities that commander classes should have. In Yggdrasil, commander classes branched out into 2 paths that could be loosely defined as generals and captains. Generals were the support type, who provided their benefits from the rear. Their active skills affected a large number of subordinates under their command. The passive effects they conferred to those subordinates was also greater than that of a captain. Captains were durable combatants who led from the front. They had extremely powerful active skills that affected a small number of subordinates, but their army-wide effects were weaker than that of a general. One was far easier to pick off than the other, especially when the locals were so weak that they could die before supporting forces could react. That being said, having both was optimal. Powerful, by the standards of this world, escorts and equipment were simple enough to provide for general types while they commanded a division made up of contingents led by captain types. If all else failed, there was always resurrection. Examples of both generals and captains could be found in this new world, but, like many things, things were not exactly the same. One might mistake the job and racial classes of this world's natives as identical to those of Yggdrasil. Most of Nazarik's denizens did just that in the period following their arrival, but as time went by, it was clear that they were not. According to Pandora's actor, classes in this world were seemingly formed out of ideas, the manifestation of a society's law and traditions. Skills, abilities, spells and martial arts were the product of purposeful development, and not guaranteed to be uniformly practiced by those that possessed what appeared to be the same class. He even went so far as to present the possibility that each person's, or at least culture's, classes were unique to them, a product of one's journey through life and how the systems of this world seemingly facilitated the conceptualization of identity. They only appeared to be the same because each person tended to adhere to the standards of their respective cultures. Even balance was seemingly non-existent, many classes were inordinately weak and seemingly incomplete. Some existed that would be considered absurdly powerful if not for the generally low level of the native population. Mechanical restrictions, requirements and prerequisites that one from Yggdrasil was accustomed to often did not exist, while new ones formulated from societal perceptions appeared in their place. It was both confusing and confounding, especially considering that Cocytus and his general staff were now exploring the possibility of recruiting local commanders. An ability that appeared commonly enough amongst commanders of this world was the ability to freely communicate over long distances in a way that was akin to an advanced message spell. As it happened, it was also an ability that all commanders had in Yggdrasil. By gaining in classes with commander skill sets, the range of the ability increased. With enough levels, a commander could match the range of message, and communicate with entire armies. This was the main reason why he had the dwarf commander-in-chief issue the orders for the War Council's plan, and he appeared to do so without questioning whether it was possible or not. Between other cases observed both within the Sorceress Kingdom's borders and beyond, it meant that it should at least be common knowledge where commanders were utilized. It would be one of the first things that the army's field commanders would be trained to do. Everything else would come in time as they gained experience. This tactic, Cocytus said, displeases you? I'm not sure what to think, really, the commander-in-chief replied. When we put it together, it sounded so unbelievably simple. And it was, disgustingly simple. Even if they're the enemy, I can't help but feel for them. Cocytus issued a grunt as he slowly nodded in agreement. As a creation of the Supreme Beings, he had been blessed with power that was in no way an achievement of his own. But he was instilled with the mindset of a warrior, and his way of thinking was often out of alignment with the other Guardians. They mostly treated what they had been bestowed with as a matter of course, and the toil and effort of others as unworthy of note. He, on the other hand, recognized a warrior's spirit, the hard work, resolve and meaning that one placed in their existence, regardless of their strength. Cocytus thought that perhaps, as his colleagues built up their own achievements over time, they would also come to develop an appreciation of the strange beings that they had come to rule over in their master's name. The reaction of the commander-in-chief reflected his feelings on the sheer waste that came with the fall of hundreds of frost giants, the time, effort and resolve that had just been callously cast into oblivion. There were those amongst the other NPCs that might enjoy such scenes, but he did not. By my request, Cocytus told him, did you carry this out? The burden of responsibility is the Sorceress Kingdom's. Your tactic, sound. The inspiration, from where did it come? Our kingdom's been on the back foot for over a century, the commander-in-chief said, so we have plenty of defensive tactics like this. Shield walls protecting mages or crossbowmen, or just defending the walls. I saw how well these Death Knights could block frost giant boulders, so I figured the same thing could be done. Wasn't sure if you had any mages, but then one of your vassals, the short brown one, said that we should stick in a soul eater. His tactic was simple enough to understand once it was presented. Death Knights would use a defensive formation structure to defeat incoming ranged attacks from the frost giants. To mitigate the knockback from the boulders, the ranks of the formation would be set 5 deep. In the middle of the protective wall of shields was a single soul eater, and they would all advance up towards the enemy line. Once they got into range, Cocytus looked up towards the huge semicircle of dead frost giants. Their position was a strong one, but ultimately ineffective against wide-area death effects. Of the hundreds of giants that stood defiant against them, perhaps 24 remained standing. They were either strong enough to reliably resist the soul eaters, or just lucky. Some stood looking about in confusion while others charged down at the Death Knight formations, perhaps understanding that a hidden threat lay behind the wall of shields. The commander-in-chief let out a sigh. Poor fools, he said. Only people as strong as these frost giants can fight so hard that their whole damn race runs headfirst into oblivion. They've never had to fight something so much stronger than themselves before, and they don't know the meaning of surrender. Indeed, Cocytus replied. It is a shame. In the world beyond, others may exist like this. But, what can be done? I don't know, the commander-in-chief said. A gentleman like yourself might be able to bring them to heal through force alone, but that probably won't do anything about how a culture based on their overwhelming strength interacts with others. Something like that would require an act of divine intervention. Sigurd stormed his way towards Thingvellir. Snow and ice flew before his furious steps and the ground quaked under his cold wrath. Anger was not all that fueled his conviction, there was also remorse. Remorse over the state of his people. Over the fact that he had not done what tradition had demanded of him before it was too late. Complacency. Sloth. Decades of shirking the duty of the strong. It was as much his fault as anyone else's. No, if anything, Sigurd's failure to act had brought the judgment of the gods upon his people. Upon learning of what had occurred, of the cursed fate that would befall the tribes, fury welled up from within. He shouted and raged and smashed down one of the walls of the icy hut under the mountain. Into the bright daylight he ran, going straight to his village to arm and equip himself with what he could find on such short notice. There was no time to locate what had been lost, for the reckoning that stood at the end of all his squandered years was already at hand. In his wake came the Valkyrie, Shiltir Bloodfallen, and her shield maiden, Ludmilla Zaradnik. They rode upon the back of the dragon, Fimbulvet, who did not appear very pleased. "I can't believe I'm being ridden," she complained. "I can't say that I've seen any of the nobles in the city using their vassals as mounts, either." "Hejinmal carried his majesty on his back when we first met," the Valkyrie replied. "It was a great privilege and honor for him to be allowed to serve as a mount. Aura rides her pets around all the time as well." "I'm not a pet." "But you will be, yes? Unless you mean to say that you're defying my instructions." Fimbulvet fell silent, gliding quietly after Sigurd. He felt it an odd exchange to have with the circumstances as they were. Odder still was having a frost dragon following him around without their trying to kill one another. Then again, it seemed that the entire world had been turned on its head. The prophecies of old had passed them by unawares. The fate of the gods, where the honored dead would be called upon to fight the final, great battle, would never come, for it was already gone and done. For 5 centuries, they had been oblivious of the new world that they now dwelled in. It was ludicrous. So ludicrous that Sigurd could only agree with the gods' disgust at his people. Yet, they had been granted a chance. One final chance to set things right again, to prove that they were worthy of existence. The frozen landscape went by as he dashed over fields of rugged ice. It was over 30 kilometers to Thingvellir, and the way wound along an uneven route, going by several mountain peaks. It would be an otherwise simple journey for him, a relaxing day's stroll, but need now drove him forward and he worried over whether he could make it in time. In his haste, he left Gudrun and the others who wished to follow far behind. The Valkyrie said nothing of his decision, neither did she give any hints of what his fate might be. It felt a test, a challenge that faced the storied men and women in the tales of old. And a challenge would await him. Jarl Vali Stenberg and the rest of his cronies were craven and had surely stayed behind in Thingvellir rather than march with the army to face the Knight of Niflheim. They would have held back their strongest from the battle, their champions, blackguards and loyal housecarls. Contrary to what his name might suggest, Vali Stenberg would most likely choose his champion, Håkon, to fight in his stead. That was if he even entertained the notion of a challenge. Sigurd believed that he would, however. He did not think his people as a whole had fallen so far just yet, and turning Sigurd down would damage Jarl Stenberg's position as a leader and his standing amongst the other Jarls. It was late in the afternoon when his steps slowed and they came into the shadow of the mountains that loomed over Thingvellir. Across the vast vale that lay under the tallest peaks of the Azalisia Mountains, the camps of hundreds of frost giants were spread out as far as the eye could see. As he made his way through them, it was clear that none were occupied, even the places of honor where the tribal leaders should be. It has already started, then. But where are the Jarls? Did they actually find the courage to fight? He continued working his way through the camps until he spotted several people slowly walking north. Breaking into a jog, he called out for them to stop. They turned in his direction, wide-eyed at his approach. The group appeared to be a family, adorned in hides that were not the armor of a hunter or warrior, but those of simple villagers. A man and a woman each held a spear, while the children dragged bags of stones behind them. Where? Sigurd glanced behind himself, belatedly recalling the fact that a frost dragon was tailing him. Fimbulvet was nowhere to be seen, however. The Valkyrie and her shield maiden were following in his trail, with an additional female beside them. The frost dragon certainly lived up to her crafty reputation. He turned back to the family. "Where is everyone?" he asked. "Why have villagers armed themselves like this?" You haven't heard?" The man answered. "The Jarls had the citadels and all the villages emptied. Everyone has been called to fight the lowland invaders coming from the north." "From where did you travel?" "Vestberg." It was the tribe to the west, the furthest of the central tribes from Thingvellir. The call to arms meant that the army had been defeated, or they at least required help. No, knowing what came, they were almost certainly all dead. "How long ago was this?" "Word came this morning." We're the last, I think. With a nod, Sigurd jogged off, and the family stared after him and his diminutive following. Did they recognize the Valkyrie? Or had they forgotten altogether? In addition to flouting the traditions of their ancestors, the central and northern tribes considered the histories and lore left to them nothing more than fanciful myth. It was well-worn entertainment at best. Following the procession of villagers north, he finally came upon the main body of frost giants. They were loosely arranged in a line just beyond the northern entrance to Thingvellir. Most looked to be armed in whatever they could find. Sigurd turned to address the Valkyrie and her companions. "It will be better if I go alone from here," he told them. "I have no desire to see what will happen if someone accidentally steps on a Valkyrie." The three before him exchanged glances. "So he says," the Valkyrie said. "This fool is just going to go in and challenge this lot?" Fimbulvet's tone was incredulous. "He might be stronger than the rest, but they'll still chop him to bits right after he opens his mouth." "I will not allow that to happen," Sigurd told them. Fimbulvet turned a dubious expression upon him. A hole, darker than the fading twilight, appeared in the air between them. "Sigurd has been charged with the fate of his people," the Valkyrie said. "Come, let's see what destiny has in store for them." One by one, they disappeared into the hole. Fimbulvet paused to sniff at it suspiciously. The Valkyrie's shield maiden pushed her through from behind. When the hole in the air closed, Sigurd took a deep breath before turning to approach the frost giant line. Finding Jarl Stenberg and his followers was a simple enough task. They were the only people in the entire group who had any semblance of proper equipment. Well armored and wielding mighty weapons, they stood out starkly against the throng of villagers with their crude long spears and common adornment. It also helped that the Jarl and his housecarls had safely placed themselves well behind the line. As he approached the Jarl and his men, one of them looked up and said something. Their discussion quieted as they turned their attention to him. "Sigurd?" Jarl Stenberg was a man in his prime, adorned in the black plate mail armor worn by the frost giant elite. A pale gold beard spilt out in waves over his breastplate, and a hand rested atop of the haft of his finely crafted great axe. Eyes that matched the color of his hair peered out at him from under the shadow of his helm. "What are you doing here, and what in the world happened to you?" Sigurd supposed that he did not appear as he usually did. The armor he wore was borrowed and did not fit quite right, and a regular iron axe was a poor substitute for his missing frost reaver. "Well, no matter," Jarl Stenberg looked up at a distant sound. "Frost reaver sent his son instead of you, so I figured he was holding back on us. It's a good thing you came to your senses." Speaking of Gunnar, Sigurd asked, "Where is he? What of all the warriors that came to fight from all the tribes?" "He was sent north to defend the other side of the central valley," the Jarl answered. "The rest were useless." "Useless?" "They fought and they died," Jarl Stenberg said. "Didn't even last the morning. The other Jarls were probably just like old Frost Reaver, selfishly holding back their best to protect themselves." "And what of you?" Sigurd glanced around them. Was he blind to his own hypocrisy? Aside from Jarl Frostreaver's two blackguards and Sigurd's warband, Gunnar had been sent with nearly all of the Frostreaver tribe's warriors and hunters. They had sent everything, save for the bare minimum that was required to defend their territory. Meanwhile, Stenberg was surrounded by dozens of his best. Then the other Jarls stayed back in their citadels? "The three in the north did," Jarl Stenberg replied, "just like Frostreaver. Ostrberg and Vestberg showed up, but Vestberg ran back to his citadel after what happened this morning." "And Ostrberg?" "Dead." Sigurd fought to keep a sneer from his lips. It was a warrior's place to fight and defend a tribe's territory, yet Vestberg had fled and sent villagers, even children, in his stead. If Sigurd had his way, he would drag these cowards out and hang them from their citadel walls to be eaten alive by the ravens, but first, he needed to deal with the craven Jarl before him. "Show me to this enemy," he said. Jarl Stenberg jerked his head towards the lines of villagers to the north. "They're just across the field if you want to see them for yourself. What do you have in mind?" "I thought a challenge would be appropriate." "A challenge?" The Jarl snorted. "I don't even know why you think that'd work. Did Frostreaver send more warriors? Where is your warband?" "I rushed here on my own," Sigurd replied. The Jarl wrinkled his nose, a disgusted frown forming behind his beard. "Sigurd is stronger than those black-armored fellows across the field," one of Stenberg's huntresses said from nearby. If it came to a challenge, he would easily win. Jarl Stenberg gave her a sour look. Yeah, his voice dripped acid, and then what? You think they'll all just conveniently line up for him to fight? What sort of idiot would allow that? The huntress frowned and turned her gaze away from them. What do we have to lose? Sigurd asked. Every one of our people's enemies that I destroy is one less to worry about. Fine, whatever. Jarl Stenberg waved him away with a dismissive gesture. It's your life to throw away. You will not come and bear witness? Why, truly, this man is dead inside. Even with a powerful champion heading out to challenge fate, not a shred of interest could be seen in the Jarl. Sigurd looked pointedly to the Jarl's retinue, who at least showed a bit of excitement at the prospect. Jarl Stenberg did not miss his look. He turned his gaze over the men and women nearby, then hefted his axe. If you insist on turning yourself into some sort of side amusement, he said, then be my guest. They made their way through the crowd, stirring the curiosity of the mustered villagers. Upon breaking through to the far side, Sigurd found a familiar sight. Just over 500 meters away stood hundreds of black-armored shield-bearers ordered in neat formations. They were the same undead beings that he saw lined up along the Dwarven Highway weeks ago. With what he now knew, Sigurd understood them to be an army from Niflheim, the dark and misty realm of the unworthy dead. Far ahead of them, a row of figures stood. The Valkyrie in her blood-red armor stood in stark contrast to the clear snow. Her two companions were beside her. To the right of them stood a figure that was nearly a head taller than the undead warriors. It was insectoid in appearance and gripped a halberd in one of its claws. Its carapace glistened in the bright blue hues of glacial waters. Sigurd had no doubt in his mind that this being was the aforementioned Knight of Niflheim, one who ruled over its frozen rivers. Steeling himself, he strode out towards them. 100 meters out from the frost giant line, he stopped and raised his axe overhead. The murmur of curious discussion behind him stilled. I am Sigurd, son of Sigmund, his booming voice echoed from the walls of the valley. Champion of the Frost Reaver tribe. In this place where three valleys meet, in the eyes of the gods and by the traditions of our ancestors, I declare my right to challenge. Sigurd turned to face the frost giants, lowering his axe to level it straight towards his adversary. You are called to Holmgang, he shouted with barely contained fury. Varli Stenberg. A dull murmur rose from the frost giant lines at Sigurd's declaration. Jarl Stenberg's face twisted in pure confusion, features turning dark with anger. Have you gone mad? He roared over the din. There's an army of the undead right in front of us. They are no longer your concern, Sigurd told him. You have been challenged, Varli Stenberg. What is your answer? Holmgang was a custom that hailed from the time that the frost giants plied the seas, sailing in their fleets to raid and plunder distant shores. If ever there was a dispute, a challenge, or an insult, the two parties would fight on a small island to settle their grievance. Though their seafaring days were long past, Holmgang was still practiced on land. One could not simply refuse this challenge, and failing to appear and defend oneself put them outside of the law. To kill someone in a duel was not considered murder, and it was winner-take-all. Rank and position, even that of a jarl, did not offer any protection. To call upon such antiquated, savage customs, Stenberg spat, and you have no reason to. Besides, I have never wronged you or taken anything of yours. What slight? Your entire existence is a slight. Sigurd snarled, an insult to our traditions and the memory of our ancestors. You and the other jarls have led our people down the path of weakness and decay, and it is long past time to set things right again. His voice echoed in the silence that followed. Men and women looked to one another. Did they understand? Or had they all lost their way just like their decadent leaders? Weakness? Stenberg replied, the tribes have grown under our rule. We have never been stronger than before. You mistake numbers for strength, Sigurd said. And your faith in numbers has led you to scheming and politicking. The little strength that you possess allows you to rule over a weakened people. You have forgotten what true strength is, the resolve and spirit of our ancestors that brought the favor of the gods upon us. Have you forgotten the teachings that were left in our keeping? Teachings? You mean those old and dusty myths? Our mystics channel the power of our ancestors every day. The myths have nothing to do with our ancestors. Our ancestors followed those very teachings. Sigurd told him, our people are out of time, Stenberg. The gods have sent the army of Niflheim against us, their judgment for our falling away from the true path. This is our last chance. Jarl Stenberg gave him a sharp look. What are you talking about? Sigurd pointed behind him, towards the undead lined up across the field. The Jarl's gaze followed the line of his arm, and his cheek twitched. You are insane, he said. Delusional. I do not need to stand here and listen to the ramblings of a madman. The accusation has been laid against you, Sigurd told him. If you walk away. Stenberg glanced over him with a sneer, then turned to walk away. Håkon, he called out, put down this rabid animal. Stenberg's champion stepped forward. The other frost giants came to form a semicircle around them. It would normally be a ring, but they were probably wary of the army across the field. Our equipment is not a match, Håkon noted as he came forward. He doesn't need any damn equipment. Jarl Stenberg shouted from the sidelines. Håkon snorted at the Jarl's voice, waiting for Sigurd to reply. The champion of the Stenbergs was adorned in the plate mail of a blackguard. A tall kite shield covered 2/3 of his body, and he held a fine bearded axe casually against his leg. It will make up for the difference in our skills, Sigurd returned with a grin. Håkon barked out a laugh. Very well, he said. You are the challenger, name your rules. The old way, Sigurd replied. There can be only one. The Stenberg champion nodded slowly before lowering himself into a defensive stance. I believe I've already struck the first blow, Sigurd said. I await your reply. Håkon advanced grimly, looking out over the rim of his shield. As he came close, the kite shield shifted slightly and his bearded axe darted out. Sigurd bent his body to avoid the sudden strike. By the time he recovered, Håkon's weapon had already disappeared back behind his shield. Blackguards were defensive warriors, so this much was not a surprise. The styles employed were varied, however, and they were complemented by a blackguard's skills and spells in addition to their martial arts. Fighting against them was distinctly different from fighting a regular warrior. From the first strike, at least, Sigurd understood that Håkon was a shrewd combatant, worthy of serving as a housecarl. Sigurd's steps drew him in a circle as he moved to Håkon's right. He abruptly shoved his left hand forward, punching the blade of his long-handled great axe straight at Håkon's head. The blackguard used the rim of his shield to drive Sigurd's attack to the side. His bearded axe came up to hook the haft of Sigurd's weapon below its head. Sigurd felt pressure against the end of his weapon, and he chuckled. Håkon's eyes widened in the shadows of his helm as he realized his error. The blackguard tried to slam the boss of his shield into Sigurd's face, but Sigurd simply brought the haft of his weapon up to bar the way. He twisted his grip, locking their axe heads together as he silently activated Ability Boost and Greater Ability Boost. A roar filled the air as Sigurd stepped back and pulled. Refusing to surrender his weapon, Håkon was dragged out in a wide arc. With a savage tug, Sigurd ripped the weapon from his hand and sent him tumbling away. Shouts from the spectators rose as Sigurd's great axe wound around in an overhead swing. Fortress. The axe's momentum was abruptly arrested against Håkon's shield, but Sigurd was not deterred. He worked his weapon around again, in time with the blackguard's defensive art. Håkon didn't wait for the attack to land. His form blurred as he dashed under the descending blade. Shield slam. Sigurd caught the attack against his midriff, and Håkon added his full momentum to the blow. They crashed to the ground, sending snow and ice flying into the air. Håkon rolled away with his momentum. Lesser strength. Corrupt weapon. He rose to his feet, finding that Håkon had used the opportunity to retrieve his weapon from the snow. After casting the last spell, its blade pulsed with dark energy. Finally realize I'm not some unblooded brat you can just bash around? Sigurd asked. You're not an unblooded brat, Håkon answered, but I can clearly bash you around. The blackguard raised his shield again and advanced. Sigurd did not wait this time, taking a corner off of Håkon's shield. Håkon's body twisted as his arm was thrown out to the side, but he kept coming to score a blow on the outside of Sigurd's thigh. Instead of recovering from his swing, Sigurd slammed the haft of his great axe into Håkon's temple as he staggered by. Håkon rolled away with the strike, returning to his feet and shaking his head. What are you doing, Håkon? Jarl Stenberg raged from the side amidst the clamor of the crowd. Finish him off. Sigurd's face twisted into a vicious smile. Stenberg had a point, but he probably wasn't actually aware of it. They exchanged another series of blows before parting again with more cuts and bruises. With the next attack, Sigurd closed the distance to Håkon in the blink of an eye, axe raised overhead. Håkon raised his shield to intercept the blow and had his leg kicked out from under him. Sigurd's weapon arced down after Håkon as he fell. The axe stopped when it touched his breastplate. Håkon had used Fortress again. The weapon descended a second time, and the blackguard rolled aside. Sigurd stomped after him, blows hammering the ground as Håkon fell back deeper into the field from Sigurd's furious assault. Håkon finally rolled back up to his feet, eyes wide. He probably didn't like what he saw. Ear! Sigurd's roar split the air, and his axe swept out in a colossal, underhand swing. The ice cracked, split, and exploded, sending a spray of jagged chunks towards Håkon. Each piece struck him with the force of a boulder, and he was blasted backwards by the shockwave as pieces of ice rained over the field. Uncaring of the outcome, Sigurd hurled himself after his opponent. The remains of Håkon's ruined shield flew out at Sigurd, and he caught it in his teeth. "Fucking berserker," the blackguard panted. In response, Sigurd broke the shield, spitting the pieces out. Relinquished of his shield, Håkon assumed a different stance, leaning forward in a half-crouch. He circled tentatively as Sigurd continued to unleash his attacks, dodging some of them, guiding others away with his axe and blocking the rest with Fortress. Rather than tiring out, Sigurd's momentum only grew, and Håkon could barely get any of his own attacks in. Blows rang out over the valley, echoing off the mountain peaks. The frost giants had long gone silent, shocked by the fury on display before them. After yet another Fortress-augmented parry, Håkon grabbed Sigurd's axe, fixing it under his arm. He pulled himself forward, switching his bearded axe to his free hand. Unholy strike. The weapon struck Sigurd in the hip, cleaving through armor and finding bone. Dark energies racked his body. He staggered, then lurched forward to smash his helmeted head against Håkon's. A savage backhand crossed the blackguard's face, and his head snapped to the side. The grip on the great axe loosened, and Sigurd stepped in behind Håkon's sprawling form. Sigurd brought the haft of his weapon under Håkon's chin, pulling it against his neck. The blackguard's hand came up to oppose him, but then Sigurd bent backwards and lifted the 7-meter-tall giant off of his feet. When his legs stopped kicking, Håkon was cast to the ground. Sigurd fell to one knee, gripping his weapon for support. "He's down." He heard someone shout through the hammering in his ears. "He's down. Kill him." Sigurd looked up towards the frost giant line. Jarl Stenberg, along with several of his housecarls, walked towards him. "What are you doing, Stenberg?" Sigurd asked as they approached. "Getting rid of a nuisance," he answered. "Your champion is dead," Sigurd said through ragged breaths. "By the laws." "Shut up. All that matters is that you'll be dead." "You dare? The servants of the gods are watching." Yes, Jarl Stenberg said, "and you'll be joining them soon. You lot, put an end to this raving lunatic." Sigurd struggled to rise as they stepped forward, weapons brandished. "That's quite enough," a silvery voice chimed into the air. The housecarls stopped as a figure in crimson armor appeared before them. Jarl Stenberg leaned over from where he was standing to peer at her. "A dwarf? You fool," Sigurd shouted, "do you not recognize a Valkyrie when you see one?" "I see nothing," the Jarl said. "Only a corpse that stands before another corpse. What are you waiting for? Get rid of them." The housecarls moved forward again. "Our law describes the Valkyrie's appearer. Right. And next, you're going to be going on about Ragnarok and the Einhage?" Einherjar. Blinding light flooded the valley, driving the twilight shadows away. Sigurd held out a hand to shield his eyes. When his vision returned, the light had coalesced into a glowing figure of brilliant white. Jarl Stenberg and his housecarls were gone. All that was left of them was a huge crimson blotch staining the ice, fragments of blasted equipment, and a fine red mist that scattered in the wind. Einherjar. The word was whispered 100 times. There was no horror at the end of Jarl Stenberg and his men. Einherjar. All filled their voices, for a legend had appeared before them. Einherjar. The air trembled with rumbling giant voices. Weapons clashed against shields, booted feet stomped, and hafts struck the ground. The rumble crescendoed into a roar that rose over the mountain peaks and into the twilight. Taking wing, the Valkyrie flew over the assembled frost giants, who raised their weapons towards her in a fervid salute. When she settled above them, a hush fell over the air. "I am the Valkyrie, Shiltir Bloodfallen," her voice rang out, "and I have come to deliver a message to you, the Jotun of the Azalisia Mountains. Ragnarok, the fate of the gods, has passed." A dull murmur came from the frost giants as they looked at one another in confusion. The Valkyrie continued, stilling their voices again. "Ragnarok has passed. The gods have passed. The prophecies have passed. No longer are you bound to prophecies and fate. For this is the new world now. A new world with new ways. A new world where the legends will be those of your own making." Weapons and fists were lifted into the air. Eyes shone with the Valkyrie's message of a brave new world. As fervor rose into the air, the Valkyrie spoke again. "The new world awaits." Shiltir Bloodfallen declared, "New sagas await. Glory awaits. And who better to lead you to glory than the god of death?"